Today on At Issue, a new generation copes with the fallout of Indian residential schools.
For the past 100 years, our people have been carrying with them every day in hurt and shame and sadness. So many little children entered with a pure heart and left with a broken spirit.
That's At Issue today. Welcome back. I'm Karen Pugliese. At Issue today, growing up with parents who suffered trauma. Our next guest is the daughter of 2 Indian residential school survivors. Her own experience growing up led her back into Aboriginal communities. Joining us is Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux. Welcome to the show. So Cynthia, what did you know about your parents' residential school experience while you were growing up?
Oh, very little. When I was growing up in Toronto, which was where a lot of the residential school survivors went to urban centers. There was really no discussion about residential school and what had happened there. I often wondered, why was there so much difficulty in our community? There was a fair bit of drinking in those days, and a fair bit of violence, and I guess there still is, but there was quite a lot of it. And what I really often wondered, what's this all about?
Yeah, why is
this
it happening to us?
Yeah,
why is it happening in our communities?
Because growing up in Toronto, had a lot of friends who were obviously not native, and I didn't see the same kinds of things happening in their families as was happening in mine. And so I was wondering, well, what was this all about?
Well, what was happening in your family?
Well, there was a lot of, I think there was a lot of drinking that went on in those days, and a lot of weekend things going on, and some fighting, and there was a fair bit of domestic violence. I mean, my stepfather was a pretty unhappy guy, and so there was a lot of aggression in him that came out in the context of our family, and I didn't necessarily see that in other places when I went to visit with other young people. So I was always like, well, why is that happening?
You see violence towards you, towards your mom?
To me, there was no real violence except for verbal abuse was more than anything, and I think he probably learned that at school. That was a way to get people to come into line. So if I did something that he perceived as wrong, he would verbally assaultive. But with my mother, there was a lot of violence with when they were drinking, or when he was drinking. There was a lot of lashing out and a lot of mean statements and things. He didn't deal with an issue well. It was like from going from 0 to 60 right away. So we're not going to say, well, what's happening, and let's have a conversation. It was immediately to the rage and the anger, and that was really hard to deal with.
Well, at some point, you did find out about their experience at residential school. When did you start to talk about it?
I found out that they went to residential school when I got to be old enough to be in conflict with them myself. And my mother said, I should send you to Shingwak. I mean, that's where we had to go, and you should go there too.
Shingwak being one of the residential
Shingwak was
schools.
Lucky for me, that was the year they closed down, so I never got to go, and so that was fine. But and that was when it was first raised, and I was probably then about 14. And I remember thinking, well, what's Shingwak? And so, she said they had to go to boarding school. They called it boarding school. They didn't call it residential school. That she had gone to boarding school with her sisters. And so that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And I really didn't understand what that meant, though, until I was much older. I saw that, obviously I lived with the results of that, but I really didn't understand what it meant until I actually was able to do the research and start looking into it. And it really didn't become a conversation in Canada, don't forget, until after 1990,
right, when
Phil Fontaine raised it after the Mount Capsule in Newfoundland incident, where the students came forward and said that they'd been sexually assaulted by the priests and and whatever they called them then, the caretakers at that school. And Phil Fontaine actually went on TV and said, well, that happened to me as well, and it happened to many people across Canada, and we were all subjected to some of those abuses and what that had meant in his life and in his relationships. And then I was like, yeah, I absolutely understand what he's talking about, because I then was able to sort of reflect back on the relationship that my parents had had, and then reflect on some of the relationships of other people around them, and I could see and understand much more clearly what had gone wrong.
Well, why are you so convinced that the things that you saw happening in your family were linked to the residential schools?
Well, I was convinced because when I started to listen to what he talked about in terms of some of the sexual abuse that went on, you know, a lot of it, of course, being adult on child, but some of it was child on child as well, and that was some of the harder stuff that I think we're grappling with today. But there was a lot of sexual violence and a lot of verbal abuse, which I had been subjected to through my stepfather, and there was a lot of alcoholism that was a result of those kinds of behaviors and things happening to young children growing up, and then not being able to deal with the memories, or not being able to deal with those experiences, and then drinking to try to quell that and push that away. And I understood then that that was what had happened in a lot of instances. And I also was very, because I had also had to deal with sexual abuse as a child, not from my stepfather, thankfully, but from other people that were around, because there was a lot of drinking that went on in the weekends and a lot of people around. I understood, you know, that's where a lot of that came from.
So, not having gone to a residential school yourself, but growing up in this environment, how were you impacted? I mean, obviously, you just said you were sexually abused.
Quite an impact.
But I guess you know, what I'm asking is like, do you feel okay?
Well, I often have a good laugh like this with my students, because I always tell them, and I'm okay, as far as I'm concerned. Somebody else might not agree. What happened is I wasn't okay. I wasn't okay, and my mother and I have had a long conversation about this. My mother died this last summer, but we had conversations about it and the implications of it, because, you know, in residential schools, children were not loved. They were not held. They were not, at least not good touch. They didn't experience that. So my mother grew up in an environment where that wasn't part of her experience, and so it wasn't part of our experience. So the idea of actually having that kind of nurturing and closeness and, you know, I love you, and that kind of thing was not part of our experience together until we got much older, and I understood better what had happened, and my own empathy and compassion for her experience allowed us to create that kind of experience between us, and gave her the freedom to have that kind of relationship with my daughters. It affected me because there was a lot of things going on that she probably wasn't necessarily aware of, and I had to deal with it. So in many ways, you wouldn't believe it today, but then I was an invisible child. Like, I hardly spoke very much because of the experiences that I'd had. And, you know, you have that feeling when you're a child that you you have to kind of hide yourself away from a lot of those things. And, you know, there was, you know, when I was growing up, it affected my ability to be discerning about my relationships and sexuality. So a lot of the kids in our communities, including myself, you know, become sexually active far too young, because we're already introduced into that, and there's no real boundaries.
We see a lot of young pregnancies.
Exactly.
Too,
So there's no boundaries that tell us that, you know, this is not okay, or how do we make those choices in a good way.